All right, so we're going to dive into some pretty heavy stuff today, and I think it's a story that a lot of people might already know bits and pieces of, but I think when we put all the details together, it's really unsettling.
Yeah.
We're talking about the case of Anneliese Michel,
Okay.
and just to kind of set the scene right, imagine you're a teenager, 16 years old, living in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and suddenly you start having these terrifying visions, these whispers, and your body's just like convulsing.
Oh,
At first, you and your family, everyone's thinking, okay, this has got to be something medical,
of
right?
course, yeah.
But as things progress, they get so much worse.
Yeah.
It's not just visions anymore, but she's like lashing out. There's these bizarre voices, and anything holy, like crosses or anything, she just like recoils from.
Oh.
And that's when her family starts thinking, okay, maybe this is something way beyond what doctors can explain.
Right. Yeah, you can see how they might jump to that conclusion, especially back then.
For sure. And for anyone listening who's ever wondered about that line, where does medicine end and something like the supernatural begin?
Mm-hmm.
Annelise's story it's a really powerful and disturbing example.
Yeah, it's a classic case, really, and it gets brought up a lot, particularly when we talk about the history of exorcisms.
Exactly.
And that's the core of what we're looking at today, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out if what happened to her was truly demonic possession or if there could be some scientific explanation for all this suffering she went through.
It's a story that's stuck with people, even decades later, because it really makes you think about the nature of belief and how it can shape our experiences.
Absolutely, and I think to understand it fully, we've got to put ourselves back in that time and place.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're talking about Bavaria, Germany, back in 1952. That's where Anneliese was born.
Okay.
And her family, very traditional, very devout Catholic.
Right. Fair religious.
From what we know, her childhood was pretty, I guess you could say normal, even sheltered maybe, until she hit 16.
And that's when everything changed.
Yeah. At 16, things took a really dark turn, a sudden, terrifying turn.
Yeah, it was like a switch flipped, right? She had this massive seizure out of nowhere.
Wow.
Her body just went rigid, convulsing really violently.
Mm-hmm.
And afterwards, she was totally disoriented, scared, which is understandable, right?
Of course, yeah. I can't even imagine.
So her parents, obviously, they're desperate to figure out what's going on, so they take her to doctors.
Makes sense.
And the diagnosis they get is temporal lobe epilepsy.
Okay. And I'm guessing some of our listeners might not be familiar with that, so could you maybe break that down a bit?
Yeah, for sure. So temporal lobe epilepsy, it affects this part of your brain, the temporal lobes, and these lobes are super important for how we process emotions, our memories, even how we perceive the world around us.
Right, so it's not just about physical movements then, like we typically associate with seizures.
Exactly. It can really mess with your senses and your emotional state.
And would you say the diagnosis, based on the seizure, made sense at the time?
Yeah, I mean, given what they knew and how the seizure presented, it seems like a plausible explanation.
Oh, yeah.
But then things got really complicated because on top of the seizures, Anneliese started experiencing other symptoms.
Oh, so it wasn't just the seizures.
Not even close. She started seeing things like these shadowy figures, really grotesque faces.
Like hallucinations.
Yeah, like really vivid hallucinations. And then there were the voices, too, these sinister whispers, constantly taunting her, telling her she was damned, that she was going to hell.
And that must have been terrifying, hearing that constantly.
Absolutely, but here's what's even more disturbing, and this is really what started pushing everyone towards the idea of possession.
What's that?
These experiences, the visions, the voices, they seemed to get way worse whenever she was praying.
Oh, wow. So it was like tied to her faith somehow.
Exactly, and for her and her family, that was like undeniable proof that she was under attack by something demonic.
Yeah, I can see how they would interpret it that way, especially given their religious beliefs.
It's like when you already believe in something, any experience that seems to confirm that belief becomes really powerful.
Right, and it can be hard to see it any other way, especially when it's something as scary and personal as this.
And the thing is, it didn't stop there. Her behavior became, honestly, really frightening.
What do you mean?
She would, like, collapse on the floor, growling like an animal.
What?
Yeah, it was really disturbing. She'd rip her clothes off, refuse to eat anything.
That's awful.
And it gets even worse. I mean, some of the details are really hard to hear, but she started, like, licking urine off the floor.
Oh, God.
It was just awful. And her parents are watching all this, feeling totally helpless.
Yeah, I mean, they must have been desperate for any kind of explanation, any way to help her.
They really were. And at that point, they felt like medicine had failed them. They had tried everything.
So they turned to the church.
Exactly. For them, it was the only thing that makes sense, the only explanation that fit all these bizarre and terrifying symptoms, a demonic possession.
It's heartbreaking in a way because you can really feel their desperation. They're watching their daughter just deteriorate and they're clinging to whatever hope they can find.
And that hope came in the form of Father Ernst Alt, a local priest who was absolutely convinced that Anneliese was possessed.
Okay, so he was like fully on board with the possession idea.
Oh yeah, no doubt in his mind, and he was so convinced he actually managed to get the Bishop of Würzburg to approve an exorcism.
Wow, so it was official, sanctioned by the church.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Father Alt. Another priest, Father Arnold Renz, was also involved.
So you had two priests, both convinced this was demonic possession.
Right, and what followed was 10 months of, honestly, pure horror. I mean, the sources describe it in detail.
Why?
Over those 10 months, they performed 67 exorcism sessions.
67.
Yeah, can you imagine that almost every day for almost a year they're performing these intense rituals?
And did it help? Did her condition improve at all?
Tragically, no. If anything, she got worse, much worse. She was convinced that if she didn't eat, it would weaken the demons.
So she starved herself.
Completely. She refused all food.
And I imagine the exorcisms themselves were pretty grueling, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were physically and emotionally draining for everyone involved.
And the demons, did she ever say who they were, like, specifically?
It's chilling. She named them one by one.
Who were they?
Lucifer, obviously. Cain, the first murderer in the Bible.
Right.
Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. Nero, the Roman emperor who persecuted Christians. And even Hitler.
Hitler?
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
It's like a who's who of evil, both from religious texts and history.
And it wasn't just the names. Her voice would change. She'd speak in tongues, curse in different languages.
Wow, so they were really convinced that it was these different entities speaking through her.
Absolutely. And here's another thing that fueled that belief.
What's that?
They recorded the exorcisms.
Oh, what?
And on those tapes, you can hear these strange sounds, these deep, guttural voices coming from her, things that just don't sound human.
And I imagine those recordings are pretty disturbing.
They are, and they've become this big part of the whole case because people still debate what those sounds actually are.
I bet it's like evidence that some people point to, even today.
And tragically, this whole ordeal ended with Anneliese's death on July 1st, 1976.
Oh, wow.
She died from severe malnutrition and dehydration.
So basically she starved to death.
Yeah, and at the time she weighed only 66 pounds.
That's just awful. It's like a preventable tragedy.
It really is, and the legal aftermath is, well, it's complicated.
What happened?
Her parents and the two priests were actually charged with negligent homicide.
Wow. So they were held responsible for her death.
It went to trial, and even then they were adamant that they had done the right thing.
They still believe she was possessed.
Absolutely. Her mother even said, quote, "God told us to exorcise her." It really is, and it shows just how powerful their belief was, that it went beyond any doubt, even in the face of this tragedy.
Right. It shows the immense power of faith, but also the potential danger when those beliefs are not questioned, even when there might be other explanations.
And that's what we want to look at now, right? What are some of the scientific explanations for what Anneliese went through?
Exactly. Because if we take a step back and look at it from a medical and psychological perspective, there are some potential answers there.
Like the temporal lobe epilepsy, right? We talked about that earlier, how it can cause hallucinations and affect your emotions.
Yeah, and what's really key here is that temporal lobe epilepsy, it's not always about these big convulsive seizures.
Right. It can be much more subtle than that.
Exactly. It can cause all sorts of weird sensory and emotional experiences. And the hallucinations Anneliese reported, the shadowy figures, the grotesque faces, those are actually really common with this type of epilepsy.
And the voices, too, right? The ones telling her she was damned.
Yeah. Those could have been auditory hallucinations, also a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy.
And what's even more interesting is that some people with this condition report feeling a very strong religious presence during or after their seizures.
So it's like this neurological event is getting interpreted as something spiritual.
Exactly. And so it's possible, even likely, that those visions Anneliese had, they weren't supernatural. They were actually a type of seizure called complex partial seizures.
Okay, and those don't always involve the whole body convulsing.
Right. It can be more about these altered perceptions, these really intense sensory experiences.
Interesting. So we've got one potential explanation there.
But we also have to consider other mental health conditions, right?
Like what?
Schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder, DD.
Okay, and how would those fit in?
Well, with schizophrenia, you often see paranoia, this really strong belief that you're being controlled by outside forces.
And that could easily be interpreted as demonic possession, right?
Absolutely. And delusions, which are these fixed false beliefs, are also a big part of schizophrenia.
And believing you're possessed, that would definitely qualify as a delusion.
Right. And even the way she spoke, the different voices, the changes in her tone, those could be linked to schizophrenia as well.
So that's another potential explanation. But what about DD? How would that work?
DID is really interesting. It was often developed after someone experiences severe trauma.
Okay.
And it basically means that a person has two or more distinct personalities or identities that kind of take control of their behavior at different times.
So like multiple personality?
Yeah, kind of. And in Annelise's case, those different voices she used, each claiming to be a different demon, could potentially have been these different personality states, each with its own distinct way of speaking and acting.
So it's like her mind created these separate identities as a way to cope with the trauma of what she was going through.
Exactly. And given her strict religious upbringing, it makes sense that those identities would take on these demonic forms.
Right, because those figures were already so ingrained in her understanding of the world.
And this brings up another really important point, the power of suggestion, especially when you're dealing with something as powerful as religious belief.
Yeah. The sources mention something called the nocebo effect, right?
Exactly. And it's kind of like the evil twin of the placebo effect.
What do you mean?
Well, with the placebo effect, a positive belief can actually make you feel better, even if you're not really getting any actual medicine.
Right, like the power of suggestion can have a positive impact.
But with the nocebo effect, it's the opposite. A negative belief can actually make your symptoms worse, even create new ones.
So if Annalise was convinced she was possessed, that belief itself could have been making her sicker.
Exactly. And remember, she grew up in a very religious environment where the idea of demons and possession was very real.
So when her initial medical condition didn't improve, the idea of possession became the dominant explanation.
And everyone around her, her family, the priests, they reinforced that belief.
And that constant reinforcement, that constant suggestion, it could have made her existing symptoms worse, even caused her to act in ways that she thought were consistent with possession.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a way.
It's really scary to think about how our beliefs can have such a powerful impact on our bodies and minds.
And we can't forget the physical effects of what she went through, the starvation, the lack of sleep, those months of intense exorcisms.
Yeah, those things would take a huge toll on anyone.
Absolutely. And we know that severe malnutrition and sleep deprivation can cause all sorts of problems, hallucinations, mood swings, cognitive impairment.
So it's possible those things were actually making her worse,
Yeah.
contributing to the whole downward spiral.
It's like this tragic loop. The belief in possession led to the exorcisms, which involved starvation and sleep deprivation, which then made her symptoms worse, further reinforcing the belief.
It's just heartbreaking because it seems like if she had received proper medical and psychological care, things might have turned out very differently.
That's the biggest takeaway for me. Reading through all these sources, it feels like a preventable tragedy, that she was denied the kind of help that could have saved her.
And it's a reminder of how far we've come in understanding these conditions. Today, a case like hers would be approached so differently.
Absolutely. We know so much more about epilepsy, schizophrenia, DID, and other mental health issues, and we have effective treatments.
Right. Instead of exorcisms, she might have received medication, therapy, a whole team of specialists working to help her.
And that's a really important point because it shows that sometimes the real horror isn't some supernatural force.
But rather our own lack of understanding, our own limitations in dealing with the complexities of the human mind.
Annelise's story is a stark reminder of that, and it forces us to ask some tough questions.
Like what?
Like, how much do our beliefs shape our reality? How do we distinguish between what's truly supernatural and what can be explained by science? And how do we make sure that people who are suffering get the right kind of help?
Yeah, those are huge questions, and I think they're questions that everyone listening should be asking themselves.
So, as you've listened to all of this, the medical details, the psychological possibilities, the role of belief, the tragic consequences, what do you think? What resonates most with you as a potential explanation for Annelise's ordeal? It's a case that stays with you, it makes you think, and it reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we create ourselves.
Absolutely, and sometimes the most important thing is to keep an open mind, to question what we believe, and to always seek out knowledge and understanding.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to leave you with that to ponder.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning.
And remember, the truth is out there, somewhere.